different sounds, they have different vocabularies, and they also have different structures, very important different structures. That begs the question, does the language we speak shape the way we think? Now this is an ancient question. People have been speculating about this question for forever. Charlemagne, Holy Roman Emperor, said to have a second language is to have a second soul. Strong statement that language crafts reality. But on the other hand, Shakespeare has Juliet say, what's in a name? A rose by any other name would smell as sweet. Well, that suggests that maybe language doesn't craft reality. These arguments have gone back and forth for thousands of years. But until recently, there hasn't been any data to help us decide either way. Recently, in my lab and other labs around the world, we've started doing research, and now we have actual scientific data to weigh in on this question. So let me tell you about some of my favorite examples. I'll start with an example from an Aboriginal community in Australia, just in the far distance. How about you? It's from the way we do it. I want you all to close your eyes. Ask an English speaker to organize time. They might lay it out this way, from left to right, different way of thinking about it.
I'm skipping through it.
Here's
You
another
haven't
really
noticed.
smart human trick. Suppose I added up the color spectrum, the visual world. Some languages have lots of words for colors. Some have only a couple of words, light and dark. And languages differ in where they put boundaries between colors. So, for example, in English, there's a word for blue that covers all of the colors that you can see on the screen. But in Russian, there isn't a single word. Instead, Russian speakers have to differentiate between light blue, for the boy, and dark blue, sila. So Russians have this lifetime of experience of, in language, distinguishing these two colors. When we test people's ability to perceptually discriminate these colors, what we find is that Russian speakers are faster across this linguistic boundary. They're faster to be able to tell the difference between a light and a dark blue.
She's fun. I'd recommend it. That's why I put it in my notes. But yeah. But the point I wanted to bring up was when we're talking about color, notice not all languages treat color the same way. In fact, I know people that are also colorblind, depending on which colors they can see or not see, and so on.
I know in Japan they have a hard time recognizing the color yellow. Something that's going to give a linguistics whole gap there. So we show them the color, just they're not used to sort of being able to point out and recognize that color, so it just kind of skips over them.
Well, I hadn't heard that, but that would be interesting if we looked at
a study on it that I had saved on my main computer that you email you. You might find
That would be interesting, yes. But so if I'm looking at a color wheel, though, this
going back to the Parmenides, the problem is, are there in between colors? Yes. Who's right? Yes, there are. No, there aren't.
one on that chart.
Not on this chart. So in this context, no, there's a fine line right here between hurt and hostile. What colors are those? I picked the wrong,
let me go back here to a different.
What color are you? Bad. No, I didn't mean that. But obviously between this and this, there's got to be a range of colors there. And so in order for us to see those, we would have to have an idea of all of those colors. And I think contemporary would argue that because of the nature of the wavelength of light, that there would actually be an infinite number of possible colors that we could recognize. We would classify them, we would categorize them probably as Goluboy or Sini, right? Light blue or dark blue, right? But we could always end up creating a new color. Ever go to Sears? Well, Sears you can't go to anymore. But if you would go to a paint shop and you want white paint, how many kinds of white paint might they have, depending on the store? Pardon?
You said 50.
50, I mean, it didn't used to be that there were so many colors of white. But now, yes, if you want, you could get all sorts of different colors of white. Well, problem with Plato's theory is that in order for us to have all of the possible concepts to match the infinite number of colors, we would have to have an infinite number of concepts. And one of the reasons that made Plato's theory such a nice, acceptable Greek theory was the compact nature of it. And if you're going to suddenly discover that there's got to be an infinite amount of ideas, not only with colors, but with taste, with salty, with all sorts of problems like that, you realize that, wait a minute, this isn't really just such a nice theory. There's problems with it. And so anything to do with degrees of difference seems to be a severe problem, and that comes out in the Parmenides, right? And so apparently Plato himself, towards the end of his life, began having doubts about the effectiveness of his theory as far as explaining things. So in a sense, if Aristotle, his student for roughly 20 years, would have loved Plato, but thought that his ideas were wrong, right? Nonetheless, would have tried to solve the problem, and in a lot of ways, what we can see that Aristotle's view is an attempt to solve this dilemma, and so we're locked in with the concept of the words being what we're describing, and yes, we do have different languages, and different languages have different sets of words. So yes, if we go in the Ukrainian, she is actually Ukrainian, you end up with the problem of how do people think? Is it based on their language? And you end up with this up here. How many folks have heard of this?
I have. This was taught to me in an anthropology course or two.
This has been in and out of favor. I believe currently the majority would agree with it. It's referred to as linguistic relativity.
Wait, is that the study that I mentioned? Hold on, go back. I think I already saw it right under the Wikipedia link.
Let's send me that link, and then I'll look at it.
All right.
When I get home. But I've only got 10 minutes left. Yes, that's a compliment. Yeah, thank you. But so linguistic relativity. Can we even know what the Greeks are really thinking? Can I even know what you're thinking, actually? When we get to a contemporary philosopher, Willard Van Orman Quine, who I'll mention right away. That's who I met. So of all the philosophers that we talked about, I actually met Willard Van Orman Quine. He gave a lecture at my alma mater. And what was really neat, when I started teaching here, one of his daughters married a guy named Roberts and moved to Anchorage. And in class, I at 2 different times had 2 of his granddaughters in class. And they were absolutely shocked that I was teaching about their grandfather. My grandfather, you're talking about him in an intro. But yes, he was a famous American philosopher. And one of the ones you can do your term paper on. How many folks have decided who their term paper is going to be on, by the way? I should remind you to not forget about that, because some people think 3,000 words is a lot to write. With practice, you could write 3,000 words in an evening, no problem, right? But you might want to get started, just in case. You do have problems with that. But Willard Van Orman Quine basically will argue that translation is a lie. To think that you could read
say a poem from, say, the French. I don't know which. So Le Tombeau de Marat. The poem is actually a French poem on the cross, and it's basically, I hope you get, it's a get well card. Obviously it failed miserably. Because the person isn't well, if their condition has stabilized, you might say. But what is neat about this book, this is Doug Hofstadter. He, in France, saw that cross, apparently, decided that he was going to translate the poems, translated it, didn't like his translation, so he tried a different translation. He tried again, did about 15 different translations, till finally he thought, hey, and he emailed about 50 of his friends and asked them all to translate it, and he got all of their translations, not a single one of them the same, by the way, right? And then he put it in this book, so that you could see all the different translations yourself. And one of the times I came to class and I had photocopied the poem on one side of the paper on all of them, and a different copy, a different translation on the other side, and I handed them out with the translated side up. And I had different students read the translation. That was short, and it started to get boring after a while because it is a get well card. And then I said, turn it over, and they all realized it's the same French poem. And none of them realized that it was the same, poem. So, a perfect example of how translation. I don't think I'd call it a lie, but it's always an interpretation. And in fact, if you're talking to a friend and then someone asks you, what did they say? What you say is probably going to be not exactly what your friend said, but an interpretation of what your friend said. Right? I'm boring everyone at this point. I can tell. Remember, I was a linguist. I was a linguist for 16 years, 9 months, and 3 days. And so my job was translating. And for 4.5 years, what I did was I translated from German to Russian. But that is, wow. Got out of that. Actually, it only took me 3 years. Because by the end of the 3rd year, the guys that eventually created DragonSpeak, who worked there, created a program that basically, pardon?
What's DragonSpeak?
It was one of the first speech to text or text to speech programs.
Oh.
But in any case, they came up with a way to solve my dilemma because they had the Cray computer down in the basement do the job for me. It took me maybe a few months to proof it and correct it, and I was out of work. However, it was a lot less boring once I got into other things. Right? But so when we're going back and we're looking at Greek philosophy, and we're reading this stuff, and by the way, it's not just Greek philosophy, it's Old Testament. Are you familiar with the Old Testament? Not the New Testament, Old Testament, right? There's a fascinating book that was edited by Bloom, but it was called the Book of J. Well, paperback doesn't matter. Reading the Book of J. So Rosenberg, who is the translator, Harold Bloom was the. That's weird how that's. Harold Bloom was the editor and David Rosenberg was the translator. But he translated a specific part of the text of the Torah, which he considered to be the Book of Jehovah. right? So there are different traditions, and he took that one and he translated it into English. And it's in very simple English because he was trying to reflect how simple that particular language was. When we're reading folks like Plato, we tend to read modern interpretations of that work, use words that we're familiar with. But if you were reading it as we can look at the Perseus Project, you can see the original words. They don't have